I looked at my daughter and felt the floor tilt beneath me. Her hand was clamped around my wrist so hard I could feel her wedding ring pressing into my skin. The band was playing something bright and cheerful behind us, but her face had gone the color of old paper. "Dad," she whispered, her lips barely moving. "We need to leave. Right now." I set down my glass of scotch on the nearest table. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" She didn't answer. Her eyes kept flicking toward the hallway that led to the home office, and her grip on my arm only tightened. She pulled me through the crowd of guests, past the string quartet, past the caterers carrying trays of champagne, out through the front doors of the biggest house I had ever seen my family live in. We didn't speak again until we were sitting in my truck with the doors locked and the engine off. "Margaret," I said, "talk to me." She turned to face me, and there were tears cutting clean lines through her makeup. "Dad, the paperwork on the house. You never actually read the final closing documents yourself, did you? You just wired the money and trusted the attorney to handle everything." That question sat in my chest like a stone dropped down a well, and I felt the bottom of it before I ever heard it land. My name is Walter Higgins, and I turned 68 years old 3 weeks ago. I built Higgins Auto Freight out of one used flatbed truck I bought at auction, back when Nixon was still in the White House, and 41 years later, I had a fleet of 200 trucks running freight up and down the eastern seaboard. My late wife, Dorothy, and I raised 2 kids in a modest 3-bedroom house in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and we always told them the same thing: work hard, be honest, and never let anybody hand you something you didn't earn, because things you don't earn have a way of owning you instead of the other way around. Our son, Bradley, never listened to that lesson the way I wanted him to. But our daughter, Margaret, she was the one who called me every Sunday, who drove 3 hours to sit with her mother during the chemotherapy, who never once asked me for a dime in 34 years of life. So when Margaret's husband, Preston, told me they'd found their dream home outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, and asked if I could help with the down payment, I didn't blink. I wired $1,400,000 into an escrow account. It was supposed to be the place where my grandchildren would grow up. Tonight was the housewarming party. The house itself was the kind of place you see in magazines: white columns out front, a lawn like a golf course, a kitchen the size of my first apartment. When Dorothy and I first raised our kids, we didn't have half of this, and driving up that long driveway lined with luxury cars, I'd felt something close to pride swelling in my chest. That pride had lasted exactly as long as it took to walk through the front door, because something was wrong the moment we stepped inside. Preston wasn't greeting guests. Margaret wasn't playing hostess. Instead, it was Preston's mother, a woman named Charlene, holding court in the middle of the living room like she was the one who'd built the place brick by brick. She had a glass of red wine in one hand and was gesturing grandly at the crown molding, telling a cluster of admiring friends about her vision for the renovation. I told myself she was just an excitable mother-in-law, proud of her son's good fortune. I grabbed a club soda and found a quiet corner to watch my daughter, who looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with party exhaustion. Every time I tried to catch Preston's eye to ask him how the move had gone, Charlene seemed to materialize at his elbow and steer him toward another cluster of guests. That was when Margaret grabbed my arm and asked me to leave. Now, sitting in the dark cab of my truck, I made myself breathe slow. "The house is in your name and Preston's name," I said. "I signed off on the transfer myself. The lawyer sent the paperwork." Margaret shook her head slowly, and it was the kind of shake that told me she already knew something I didn't. I went upstairs to use the bathroom. The one by the office was open, and I saw Charlene in there, showing 3 of her friends something on the wall. They were laughing. "Dad." I walked past, pretending to look at a painting, and I saw it. The deed, framed and hanging right behind the desk. "Whose names are on it?" "Not mine, not Preston's." Her voice cracked in half. "It says Ashford Property Holdings, LLC. Dad, Ashford was Charlene's maiden name. She always bragged about it, like it made her royalty. She owns the whole house." "She owns it, and Preston let her." I sat there gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white, and I felt something inside me that I hadn't felt in a long time. A cold, focused fury that reminded me of the years I spent clawing my company up from nothing. I pulled out my phone and called my son-in-law directly. It rang twice before someone picked up, and it wasn't Preston's voice that answered. "Walter?" Charlene purred, sickly sweet, like she'd been waiting for this call all night. "Preston's just a bit occupied, moving my furniture into the primary suite. Thank you so much for such a generous gift. The line went dead before I could say a single word. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my home office in Scranton with my old laptop and pulled up the Mecklenburg County property records myself. It took me 11 minutes to find exactly what Margaret had described. The deed to the 480,000 square foot property, the one my $1,400,000 had purchased, belonged entirely to Ashford Property Holdings, LLC, and the sole managing member was Charlene Ashford Whitfield. My daughter and her husband held zero ownership in the house I'd paid for. I printed every page of it. I placed the papers in a folder and waited for the sun to come up. At 6:30 the next morning, I drove 3 hours down to Charlotte and walked straight into the regional office of Higgins Auto Freight's Southeastern Division, where I'd made Preston a regional operations director 2 years earlier because Margaret asked me to give him a chance, because I loved my daughter and wanted to believe her husband was worth the faith she put in him. I walked past the front desk without stopping and pushed open the door to his office. Preston looked up from his monitor, startled, then quickly arranged his face into something friendly. "Walter, we missed you at the toast last night. We figured you and Margaret headed out early because—" I didn't let him finish. I opened the folder and dropped the county records onto the center of his desk. He looked down, and I watched every drop of color drain out of his face like water running out of a cracked glass. "Care to explain?" I said, my voice flat and quiet. "Why my down payment bought a house for your mother?" "Walter, it's not what it looks like," he said, and his hands were already trembling. "There's context here you're not seeing. I'm seeing plenty. You have 1 minute to tell me the truth before I call my attorney and report this as fraud." Before he could speak again, the door opened, and Margaret walked in carrying 2 coffees, her smile freezing the second she saw the papers spread across the desk and the look on both our faces. "Dad," she said carefully. "What's going on?" But it wasn't Margaret who answered. Preston's expression shifted, hardened, and I watched him find his footing again the moment he realized his wife was standing beside him. "Actually, Walter, since you're here, let me explain the strategy, because you clearly don't understand how this works." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick binder with a gold-embossed logo from some Charlotte accounting firm. He set it down and folded his hands over it like a man about to deliver a sermon. "Sit down, Walter. Let me walk you through the tax implications of large intergenerational transfers, because if I'd wired that money straight into our names, the gift tax alone would have been catastrophic." He spent the next 15 minutes performing for me. Terms like stepped-up basis and temporary holding vehicle and asset protection trust rolled off his tongue with the polish of a man who'd rehearsed this exact conversation in a mirror. According to him, Charlene's accountant, a man who apparently handled portfolios for half of Mecklenburg County's old money, had advised that the safest route was to funnel the deed through Ashford Property Holdings for 90 days, after which it would transfer automatically into Margaret and Preston's names, clean and tax-free. I have run a trucking company through 3 recessions, 2 fuel crises, and 1 federal audit that lasted 14 months. I know exactly what real tax structuring sounds like, and I know exactly what a lie dressed up in a suit sounds like. This was the second one. You do not need your mother-in-law's personal shell company to shelter a residential gift tax liability. It is not how the law works, and any accountant who told him that should have his license reviewed. I kept my face still. I let the silence stretch out after he finished, because silence is the only thing that ever makes a liar nervous, and I watched it work on Margaret before it worked on Preston. She looked between us, and something in her chest seemed to collapse in on itself. "Dad," she started, her voice cracking, "how could you come down here and accuse Preston like this? He's been working himself sick trying to protect us. My mother-in-law took on the legal liability of that holding company just to help us. And instead of thanking her, you're treating my husband like a criminal in front of his own staff." I felt something twist hard behind my ribs because I recognized what was happening. It wasn't an argument anymore. It was 2 people standing shoulder to shoulder, and one of them was my own daughter, aiming everything they had at me instead of at the truth. "Margaret," I said quietly, "you saw the deed yourself. You told me last night. Whose name is on it?" She flinched like I'd struck her, and for one long moment I watched her waver, watched the truth fight against her loyalty to the man beside her. Then Preston reached over and took her hand, and something in her face closed, like a door shutting. "We were going to tell you everything once it transferred," she said. "You just couldn't wait 90 days. You couldn't give us that." I looked at my daughter, The girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long drives to visit her grandmother. The woman who sat beside her mother's hospital bed for 6 months without ever once complaining. And I understood that whoever had convinced her to stand in this office and defend a lie was not someone I recognized. I picked up the folder off the desk. 90 days, I repeated. Funny. That's exactly how long it takes an LLC's operating agreement to expire before Charlene decides whether she feels like honoring that transfer at all. There's no obligation in that filing that forces her to give up a single square foot of that house. I read the whole document last night. There is no automatic transfer clause anywhere in it, Preston. You made that part up, or somebody made it up for you. The binder on the desk suddenly looked a great deal less impressive. Preston's mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out. Walter, I swear. That's what Charlene's attorney told us. Then you should have read it yourself before you let her put my money into her own name. I turned and walked out of that office. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice again. I drove 3 hours back to Scranton in complete silence, and somewhere around the halfway point, I stopped feeling angry and started feeling something colder and more useful. I made 3 phone calls that night. The first was to my own attorney, a woman named Susan Delacroix, who had handled every contract Higgins Auto Freight had signed for the last 20 years. The second was to a forensic accountant Susan recommended. The third was to my son, Bradley, the one I'd spent years disappointed in for reasons that suddenly felt very small compared to what I'd just learned about my daughter's marriage. Susan pulled the LLC's full formation documents within 2 days. What we found made the 90-day story look like a children's bedtime tale. Ashford Property Holdings hadn't been formed the week of the closing. It had been formed 14 months earlier, back when Preston and Margaret first started house hunting, long before they'd ever asked me for a dime. Charlene had been planning this from the very beginning. She'd waited until they found a house expensive enough to be worth the trouble, then let Margaret fall in love with it before ever mentioning a word about financing, knowing full well her son would come running to me the moment the number got too big. There was more. Susan's forensic accountant found that Charlene had taken out a $200,000 line of credit against the property just 9 days after closing, money that had already been transferred into an account under her own name alone. She wasn't protecting an asset. She was liquidating one, using my money as collateral before her son and daughter-in-law had even finished unpacking their boxes. I called Margaret myself. I didn't want to send a lawyer's letter first. I wanted to hear her voice. "Sweetheart," I said, "I need you to sit down." I told her everything, the formation date, the line of credit, the number in Charlene's private account. I heard my daughter go completely silent on the other end of the line for almost a full minute, and when she finally spoke, her voice had changed entirely, gone thin and small in a way I hadn't heard since she was 11 years old, and scared of something in the dark. "Dad," she whispered. She told us the paperwork was already signed before we even looked at that house. She said it was just how her family always did things. I believed her. "I know," I said. "I know you did. What do I do?" "You come home," I said. "Bring what you need. Leave the rest." It took her 4 days to gather the courage. 4 days during which Preston apparently tried every trick his mother had taught him. Threats about the marriage, threats about the house, one night even calling me directly to accuse me of trying to buy my daughter back like she was a piece of property. I let him talk himself out. I didn't need to say much. I already had everything I needed sitting in a folder on Susan's desk. On the 5th day, Margaret called me from a rest stop off Interstate 77, 2 suitcases in her back seat, and asked if she could come stay in her old bedroom for a while. I told her the door had never once been locked. The legal process took another 6 weeks. Susan filed a civil suit against Ashford Property Holdings and against Charlene personally, alleging fraud, unjust enrichment, and breach of fiduciary duty, since Charlene had explicitly represented herself as a temporary trustee acting in Margaret and Preston's interest while quietly draining equity for herself. 2 things happened almost simultaneously. First, a judge issued an emergency injunction, freezing any further transfers out of the property or the LLC's accounts. Second, once the paper trail became public record in the court filing, 3 other families in the Charlotte area came forward with strikingly similar stories about Charlene. One involving a rental property, one involving an inheritance dispute with her own late husband's estate. It turned out my daughter's marriage wasn't the first time Charlene had built a legal maze designed to look like generosity, while quietly making sure every dollar flowed back to her. Preston was named in the suit as well, not as a fraud architect. Susan believed him more foolish than malicious, but as a participant who'd signed documents he never bothered to read because it was easier to trust his mother's word than to protect his own wife's interests. The court ultimately ordered the LLC dissolved, the property deed transferred jointly to Margaret alone, since she was the only party who could prove she'd acted in good faith throughout, and ordered Charlene to repay the $200,000 she'd drained, along with damages. Preston, facing both a lawsuit and a marriage that had cracked wide open under the weight of his mother's manipulation, moved out of the Charlotte house entirely. Margaret filed for divorce 4 months later. She didn't cry when she told me. She just said she was tired of being someone else's collateral. I want to tell you the house sat empty after that, some kind of monument to greed, but that's not how it ended. Margaret sold it within the year. She said she couldn't stand walking through those rooms, remembering the sound of Charlene's laugh floating down the stairs while she stood there, defending a lie she didn't even know was a lie yet. She bought a smaller place 40 minutes north, something modest, something entirely hers, with her name and only her name on the deed. She sends me a photo of the front porch every Sunday now, the same day she used to call just to talk. Bradley and I are working things out too, slower, in our own way. It turns out watching your sister nearly lose everything to someone else's mother has a way of making a man reconsider his own choices. He came to see me last month, sat in the same chair his sister sat in the night she told me about the deed, and told me he wanted to try running the Western Regional Office the way I'd always wanted him to, honestly, without cutting corners. I told him I'd believe it when I saw it, but I let him try. I still think about that night in the truck sometimes, the way Margaret's hand shook around my wrist, the way her voice broke asking if I'd ever actually read the paperwork myself. I think about how close I came to simply trusting the process, trusting that a smile and a folder full of numbers meant honesty. The way David's spreadsheet or Preston's binder is always designed to look convincing to a man who loves his family enough to want to believe them. Here's what 41 years of building something from nothing and one terrible housewarming party taught me. Love your children with everything you have. Give them every advantage you can afford to give. But never, ever hand over your life's work without reading the fine print yourself. And never let anyone, blood or otherwise, convince you that asking questions makes you the villain in your own story. The people who truly love you will welcome your questions. The people hiding something will call your questions cruel. Blood does not excuse betrayal, and family does not mean permission to take what isn't offered freely. My daughter learned that lesson at the cost of a marriage and a $400,000 house. I'd like to think she'll carry it with her for the rest of her life, the same way I now carry the memory of watching her hand shake in the dark cab of my truck, asking me a question she already knew the answer to. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted with your family's future was never planning to keep their word? I'd like to hear your story in the comments below. And if this story meant something to you tonight, do me a favor and hit that like button, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.